Good afternoon. Welcome to this live broadcast of the Minneapolis Charter Commission for June 7th. My name is Peter Ginder, and I'm the chair of the Charter Commission. I will now call this meeting to order and ask the clerk to call the roll so we may verify the presence of a quorum.
Commissioner Boone,
Present.
Clegg,
Here.
Commissioner Davis Carter is absent. Doherty,
Here.
Garcia,
Present.
Commissioner Hawkins is absent. Hill,
Present.
Kozak,
Here.
Metke,
Here.
Perry,
Here.
Sandberg,
Here.
Smith,
Here.
Vice Chair Rubenstein,
Here.
and Chair Ginder.
Here.
We have 12 present.
Let the record reflect we have a quorum. We will now proceed to our agenda, a copy of which was posted for public access to the city's legislative information management system, which is available at lims.minneapolis.mn.gov. Commissioners, the agenda for today's meeting is before us. May I please have a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved.
We have a proper motion before us. Is there any discussion before the clerk calls the roll? Seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll on the motion.
Commissioner Boone,
Present.
Clegg,
Aye.
Doherty,
Aye.
Garcia,
Aye.
Hill,
Aye.
Kozak,
Aye.
Metke,
Aye.
Perry,
Aye.
Sandberg,
Aye.
Smith,
Aye.
Rubenstein,
Aye.
and Chair Ginder.
Aye.
We have 12 ayes and 0 nays.
With that, the motion passes and the agenda is adopted. May I please have a motion to accept the minutes from our previous meeting? Okay. We have a proper motion again before us. Is there any discussion before the clerk calls the roll? Seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll on the motion.
Commissioner Boone,
Aye.
Clegg,
Aye.
Doherty,
Aye.
Garcia,
Aye.
Hill,
Aye.
Kozak,
Aye.
Metke,
Aye.
Perry,
Aye.
Sandberg,
Aye.
Smith,
Aye.
Vice Chair Rubenstein,
Aye.
and Chair Ginder.
Aye.
We have 12 ayes.
With that, the motion passes and the agenda is adopted. The next is the chair's report, and I have nothing to add on for the chair's report other than what will be discussed in the next items. Item 5 is on for discussion on the agenda. It's a presentation related to the government structure implementation charter amendment. And we have City Clerk, Mr. Casey Carl, present before us. Mr. Carl.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And before I get started with the presentation, on behalf of the body, allow me please to make a few introductions. We have joining us today at the dais Andrea Neff from the City Attorney's Office, Assistant City Attorney Andrea Neff, who recently has been assigned to the clerk's office, and as an extension of that is working, at least for the time being, as attorney for the Charter Commission. So we'll be attending our meetings and working with the Charter Commission on its official work in the capacity as your attorney, your legal counsel. And so I want to welcome Ms. Neff to the team and to the group, and also give her a chance to introduce herself formally. But I also would like to introduce Jody Molinar Hansen, a longtime member of the city attorney, and the city's workforce, recently has joined our city auditor's office. The city auditor's office was elevated and recreated through the charter amendment that created our new executive mayor legislative council structure authored by this body. And as part of that work, the city auditor, in addition to traditional internal audit and assurance work, is now providing the council with a dedicated nonpartisan team to provide policy level research and evaluation services. And Ms. Molinar Hansen is one of the first members of the auditor's team in the research and evaluation division. So I'll first, with your indulgence, Mr. Chair, ask Ms. Neff to give a brief introduction of herself, and then maybe Ms. Molinar Hansen can introduce herself.
Thank you, Casey. Hi, my name's Andrea Neff. I've been with the City Attorney's Office for about 10 years now, but just recently assigned to work with Casey and the clerk's office. And so I'll be here with you going forward to assist you and support you in your work. Happy to take any questions from anyone. I do recognize a couple faces, in particular Chair Ginder, who used to be my boss. So it's good to see all of you.
And I would just note that we're very fortunate to have Ms. Neff assigned to the commission. Her work is really excellent, so I'm pleased to have her here.
Hi, this is a little unexpected. I'm Jody Molinar Hansen. As the clerk mentioned, I am now working in the Policy and Research Division of the Office of City Auditor. I've been at the city for over 28 years, the last 15 as the manager of continuous improvement, helping departments improve the work that they're doing. And it's nice to see Mr. Ginder. We've worked together in the past as well. So, hello.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me that moment to introduce the staff who are going to be working with us. And I say that because not only in their capacity working directly with the council and also with this body, but one of the first priorities that we've been working on in the city attorney's office, a partnership that will involve the city attorney's office, the city auditor's office, and the clerk's office, is a process to reform the city council's legislative process. And so if you have been tracking what we're doing at the city council recently in front of the council's committee of the whole government structure subcommittee, we've been talking about reforms to the council's legislative process to make that process more transparent, more accessible, understandable, and available to the public at large. And Ms. Molinar Hansen is the project manager leading the legislative process reform. So grateful to have her, and obviously as we codify those reforms in ordinance, working with Attorney Neff. So moving forward to the government structure implementation sort of status report. Hopefully you have a copy of a couple pages, looks like about this, and then we have a 5 PowerPoint slides I'm going to try and walk through very quickly, but I tried to put a brief status report together for us here. This first slide shows you a timeline since the proposal that this body put forward for the Executive Mayor Legislative Council was put forward and approved by voters at the general municipal election on November 2nd, 2021, city question number 1, which was approved, and then adopted and codified as Charter Amendment number 184, became legally effective December 3rd of 2021. This body is well aware that the mayor quickly appointed a group, an advisory group, to think about how the executive function of mayor could be best organized. And then we spent almost all of 2022, once the mayor put forward a proposal in March on how he would recommend the executive branch of government be organized. That was negotiated between the mayor and the council. And finally, in October, we did adopt ordinance number 2022-045, which was what we referred to as our government structure omnibus ordinance. It put in place the new operating structure for the city enterprise, shown on this slide and also on the handout I gave you. So you can see the major changes, as we've discussed previously, to the structure are really centralizing and consolidating, streamlining under the executive mayor the operating departments that are part of what we refer to as the city's administration. These are the departments that deliver the city's services, manage its programs, and operate the day-to-day mechanics of the city government as a municipal corporation. The mayor essentially is assisted in performing those executive functions by a cabinet of 3 executives who are appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the council. That is the city operations officer, and the city operations officer is reflected here in the blue circle called Office of Public Service. So the Office of Public Service is headed by the city operations officer, and reporting to that office are 17 of our 25 operating departments. For those of you who are familiar with other forms of local government, the city operations officer is modeled very closely on a city manager model. So the city operations officer is the chief policy advisor to the mayor, the operational director of the city's management functions. You can see that finance and property services, human resources, information technology, and a lot of those core functions that make the enterprise work report to the Office of Public Service. you'll see that 5 of our operating departments, all focused on community safety functions, are under that blue circle called the Office of Community Safety. The Office of Community Safety is headed by a new position, the Commissioner of Community Safety, and that is another direct report to the mayor. Was intended to consolidate all of the city's community safety functions, operations, and departments together under the oversight of that new executive, and so brings greater alignment and interoperability to those functions within the enterprise. And then, of course, the Office of City Attorney is very unique in the city of Minneapolis structure. A direct report, obviously, to the mayor as the city's chief legal officer and the head of the Office of City Attorney, but also is the attorney for the City Council, the Board of Estimate and Taxation, for all offices, all departments, all boards and commissions. So that's why we've included the dotted line over to council as well. The city attorney, the city operations officer, and the commissioner of community safety are the 3 members that then make up the mayoral cabinet. And then under the council, of course, you have the Office of City Clerk, and under the Independent Audit Committee, you have the Office of City Auditor, as I mentioned, newly reconstituted and elevated per this body's proposal to amend the city charter. So that structure is now in place and has been operating since October of last year. What we are hoping to focus on as we consider further amendments that may be necessary to the charter to really implement the voter-approved executive mayor structure, working with the Office of City Attorney, are a series of process and sort of operating improvements that we think would be important to make. And Chair Ginder, certainly you know this as well as anyone from your time in the attorney's office. There are a number, since our home rule charter was adopted in 1920, a wide thousands of special laws that were adopted over the city's history applicable to the city of Minneapolis that apply to us and continue to apply to us despite the fact that we have a city charter. And it would be important in our estimation for us to go through that process and look at amendments that would allow us to eliminate special laws that are no longer applicable, that are no longer needed or desired by the city, so we can sort of clean up the books, if you will. And if there are provisions of those special laws that the city feels remain compelling and of need, that we would use our home rule authority to codify those, either in the charter or in our code of ordinances. This is in keeping with the idea that a charter city should have as much local control as possible. Much of those local laws were requested by us of the state legislature over the years, despite being a home rule charter. So this is really in recognition of the idea that we're a home rule city. We should pursue home rule authority, and we should eliminate special laws that are no longer needed or applicable or relevant to the way the city's operating. So one amendment we would bring forward in Article 1, as shown here, which is sort of the high-level general introduction to our charter or our constitution, would be the appropriate amendment or amendments that would address the disposition of that history of special laws. And I'll note here that managing city attorney Susan Trammell has been working over the past year to collect an accurate listing of all of those special laws and has been working with a team to not only identify the number of special laws, but which may also have special laws that might be in conflict with each other. And so once we have that analysis completed, I would expect the city attorney's office would come forward to this body and say, here's the list, here are the special laws we recommend that we work to rescind, and here's maybe the special laws that we would work to incorporate either in the charter or in the code under our home rule authorities. So that's one of the pieces we've looked at. The next one I think is probably, I'm going to suggest, might be a Scrivener error and could probably be easily accomplished with this body's support. We talked about this body created the elevated or reconstituted Office of City Auditor as a critical piece of the council's legislative function in this new government structure. And I know that when this body worked to create the city auditor, there was much deliberate effort to ensure that that position was protected to the greatest degree possible from any inappropriate political interference or undue influence, political influence. And so there was a proposal that removal of the city auditor would be a high bar. The auditor would be appointed to no less than a 4-year term and could not be removed except for cause during that 4-year term. However, What got codified on page 20 of the printed version of our code says that the auditor may be removed subject to section 8.2G3. And I've put that on the slide here and I'm referring to it. Section 8.2G3 deals with the removal of other elected and appointed officials. What that section says is that subject to notice and a trial being conducted before the council or the appropriate appointing authority, and by a 2/3 majority vote, an official could be removed. However, despite pointing to section 8.2G3, on page 20 in the section that deals with the city auditor, 4.2G, it says that the council must by ordinance set the auditor's term for at least 4 years, during which the council may only remove the auditor under section 8.2G3 for cause by a majority vote. So under 8.2, it says a 2/3 vote, but specific to the auditor, we've lowered that threshold to a simple majority of the council. If we are pointing to section 8.2G3, it seems likely we intended that to be the higher 2/3 vote threshold. So I believe this is likely a Scrivener error. And so this body, as the author, could certainly give us that corrective direction to say what we really intended was the higher vote threshold to remove the city auditor, which is in line with what's under 8.2G3 for all other city officers. We did not intend to have the lower threshold to remove the auditor. So that would be an amendment in Article 4. And then the bulk of our proposals are upon reviewing, for many years, since the adoption of the Plain Language Charter in 2013, effective 2015, in Article 8, which deals with officers and other employees. And I think this is the section that we internally in our operations sort of get confused about the most. Article 3 deals with elected officials, appointed officials, administrative officials, and employees. It defines them, but then it doesn't distinguish between them. And so you really have to read the entire article in context to understand when we're talking about appointments, terms, removals, vacancies, how vacancies are determined, and similar types of matters. We think that the article could be rewritten and put together in a series of new sections that would provide very clear definitions. So one around officers generally. Officers include those who are elected, executive, and administrative. So officers generally, and then a section specifically on elected officials, the appointment, vacancy, resignations, holdover provisions, and how appointments could be made to fill an unexpired term. Another section would deal with what we call local appointed officials. We're calling them local appointed officials because that aligns with state statutes in terms of who is applicable or who must file, for example, statements of economic interest, disclosures, and other types of details. So local appointed officials, and then within that section, we would distinguish between executive officers, those being the mayor's cabinet, and I've listed them here, the city operations officer, community safety commissioner, and city attorney. Administrative officers, which we, the city, have defined pursuant to our government structure ordinance 2022-45. So basically, an administrative officer would be the head of each of our operating departments under the mayor, not otherwise an executive official. And then a catch-all category for other. Other would include, for example, the city clerk, the city auditor, the superintendent for the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, and other officers, staff officers from the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, and then the secretary for the Board of Investment and Taxation. So these are not executive or administrative officials under the mayor, but who need to be covered as officials or officers of the city enterprise. And then also the attorneys have identified that the Minneapolis Civil Services Commission, which deals with our professional employees and our represented groups, our labor represented groups, is created under the same article, Article 8. However, unlike the other policy-making boards that are created by the charter, and for example, I'd say the Planning Commission and the Civil Rights Commission, there is a lot of operating details put into the charter, which we like to think of as our constitution for the Civil Service Commission, that are not put in there for those other boards. We think it would be wise for us to have those policy-making boards very similar in nature and to remove the operating details from the charter and put that in code, consistent with this body's direction when we did plain language charter, that if it isn't a constitutional provision, it probably belongs in code. And so that is a very, very high-level summary of the types of amendments that we've identified to help us further implement the government structure adopted by voters in 2021. I'm happy to respond to questions about those high-level summaries.
Are there questions Commissioner Clegg.
On the, thank you, Mr. Carl. On the Article 1 amendments, it seems like there would be three baskets of special laws that we would look at. One would be ones that we need to keep. One would be ones that we could repeal, which we could do by a subsequent charter amendment. And the third batch would be those that are inconsistent with each other, but we need to keep. And those we would need to amend the charter to make consistent, correct?
Through the chair, Commissioner Clegg, I believe that is broadly correct, that there are at least those three categories. There may be additional categories for those that, there's a lot of special laws that deal with personnel. Positions that we went to the legislature and requested authority to create. And then subsequent to that, we've renamed them, we've retitled them, we've reclassified them. And so there's probably personnel and then there's operations. So I'd start with maybe the big buckets of personnel, operations, and then within those two groups, to your point, the ones that we need to keep, the ones we need to get rid of, and those that we need to address how we keep, whether they go into the charter or to the code.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Carl. I just had a question about the meeting that we are planning with the Committee of the Whole sometime in the future. Will these be some of the issues we'll be discussing with them and hearing their point of view?
Chair Clegg and to Vice Chair Rubenstein, yes. Our point for the joint meeting was exactly that, to talk about the proposals that staff have identified to help further implement the voter-approved government structure, and thinking that these are highly technical in nature, that the avenue to pursue would be amendment by ordinance or several ordinances. And so we wanted to get alignment, obviously, very early in the process, because the process of amending by ordinance, which is the way we've done the most of our ordinances over the life of the city, requires this body to first concur that yes, you would agree that these amendments could be done by ordinance, and then the city council could work with the city attorney's office, bring them forward. The city council would have to adopt those ordinances by a unanimous vote of its entire membership, so 13-0, and the mayor has to approve them. So the process is a little bit more complex, and it takes a lot more time and a lot more collaboration to make sure that all of these parties are all on the same page with respect to that slew of proposed amendments.
Thank you.
Other questions? Commissioner, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Carl, I hear what you say about the complicated, time-consuming process. What are you looking at realistically next year?
Well, realistically, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, and to Commissioner Kozak, I think that realistically it will go into next year. I think the faster we get that process started, then the earlier the actions can happen into 2024. And obviously, any action by ordinance to amend the charter is subject to a petition. And so a significant number of registered voters could petition to say, we don't want you to make those changes by ordinance, submit those to the ballot. So we'd also want to plan ahead so that if there was a petition filed, we could process that and get something on the ballot if needed. But they are very technical, sort of inside baseball, technical corrections, I would label them, to the code. And so we think that the best approach would be by ordinance, and we think that between the 15 members of this body, the 13 members of the council, and the mayor, that probably is a good process for us to do. But the earlier we start this year, the faster next year we can complete the work.
Thank you very much.
Are there other questions? I do have a question, Mr. Carl, a couple of questions. I'm assuming as these come forward, that they will be broken down into respective buckets for vote, because in my mind, some of these are probably more technical and less controversial than others, although, for example, with the special laws, you'll never know exactly what you'll find in there, and as you said, I've looked at hundreds of these, and what you find in there can sometimes be quite concerning as far as how we're actually conducting business, as everybody's forgotten about the special laws. The Article 7, employees and officers, is a little bit more complicated, I think, which might engender more controversy, it would seem to me, from council members. And so that's why I envision this coming in the buckets as these three groups. And I guess that was kind of a statement. My other question would be, do you plan on bringing forward work product to both the council and the commission before this meeting so that each side can have a look at, kind of get an outline of what we're actually talking about, and some time to reflect on it before we go into the either singular meeting or a couple of meetings as we talk with the council about what we think should be done or what their feelings are as opposed to what the staff feelings are on this.
Mr. Chair, I would say that it had been our intention, the joint meeting that was scheduled and then had to be canceled, not to necessarily have drafts prepared, fully vetted, but to stay at this high level and make sure that there was agreement and alignment between the two bodies that are ultimately going to have to work together at that high level to say yes. And if there was direction from this body or the council that we agree, for example, on Article 4's change to correct the term on how to remove in the vote threshold of the auditor, and we broadly agree on maybe this sub-piece that's not number 4 about the Minneapolis Civil Service Commission, we don't have agreement around the other pieces under Article 8, then that would give the attorneys the ability to, really spend their time on what there was agreement on. And so we do envision that there would be probably not only a series of ordinance drafts coming through the process at different times, but that this body and council would probably have to have more than one joint meeting. A joint meeting to start and sort of base everyone level set on the same expectations, and then finding alignment, and then eventually when a work product is available, bringing that through the two bodies as well.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Carl? Seeing none, I think it would be appropriate to have a motion to receive and file this report. Is there such a motion? We have a motion and a second. It's before us. Can we have a roll call, please, Mr. Clerk?
Commissioner Boone,
Aye.
Clegg,
Aye.
Doherty,
Aye.
Garcia,
Aye.
Hill,
Aye.
Kozak,
Aye.
Mecke,
Aye.
Perry,
Aye.
Sandberg,
Aye.
Smith,
Aye.
Vice Chair Rubenstein,
Aye.
Chair Ginder.
Aye.
We have 12 ayes.
That motion carries. The next item on our agenda is item number 6, which is a presentation on the rent control ordinance being considered by the City Council. I asked Mr. Carl to put that on for discussion purposes, primarily because this body was heavily involved in this issue, I guess it was a year ago, as we made our recommendations to the City Council about what to put on the ballot, what not to put on the ballot, and changes to the proposed amendment, which were not accepted on some of them. And so that amendment did pass, and so that there is a possibility for a referendum on rent control or rent stabilization. We won't have a role in that, but because of our past experience with this, I thought it would be useful just to have an update from Mr. Carl on how this process is working out before and if this goes to the voters.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so hopefully you all have a copy of this one-pager in front of you. I don't have any slides prepared, but the one-pager hopefully summarizes sufficiently. As noted, also at the 2021 general municipal election, city question number 3, as the chair alluded to, related to the authorization to create a rent stabilization policy, was approved by voters, codified as Charter Amendment number 185, and also became effective December 3rd of 2021. Since that time, the council has worked to appoint a housing/rent stabilization work group to review various options of what could be what I will call the pillars, the core pillars of a policy on rent stabilization for the city of Minneapolis. This action has happened sort of concurrently as actions have also happened in the city of St. Paul that I'm sure you're all aware of. In the 2021 election, St. Paul put forward an actual policy on the ballot. And so voters in St. Paul adopted a policy, whereas voters in Minneapolis voted on the authorization to give council the power to create a rent stabilization policy that then, pursuant to state statutes, must be put back on the ballot for voter approval. So we did a 2-step, whereas St. Paul did a 1-step process. Now that the council has the authority codified in the charter to propose a rent stabilization policy, the body, having received a report from its appointed work group, has recently moved forward. And you may be aware that at their regular meeting on May 25th, a motion was brought forward by Councilmember Shugtai that would direct the city attorney's office to go and craft a draft policy for consideration by the council. I put in front of you the motion that was adopted. It's adopted officially as Council Action 2023A-0401. That was approved on a vote of 7 ayes, 5 nays, and 1 absence. And what the core pillars are those 6 points to be included in the draft policy. It would fix rent increases at 3% annually with no adjustment provided for consumer price index. It would provide vacancy controls and no rent baking. It would not provide any exemptions for certain types or any types of housing, and no exception for new construction. There would be no exception process then for investment, substantial capital improvements. You can see the implementation and enforcement would require city certification, an oversight body to be established and appointed by the council that would be charged with program compliance and enforcement and would include an appeals process. And then the effective date, if approved at the general election this year, the goal to submit that to voters this November as part of the municipal election, would become effective 6 months after the effective date of the election. So giving a brief window of time for implementation of this brand new policy and its operationalization across the enterprise. Beneath that, I've provided for you a timeline. So in order to get a ballot question to the voters this November, the last line in bold on there is the deciding factor. We work backwards. The statutes require that the city submit any language for a ballot question by no later than Friday, August 25th. And so I have to provide the language of that to the county auditor and to the Secretary of State by that day, by close of business Friday, August 25th. Working back from that, this motion passed at the council's meeting on May 25th, asking the city attorney's office to bring forward that draft. At our next council meeting on June 15th, then we will formally begin the legislative process, which starts with a formal notice. The notice is given so that all policymakers, departments, the public are aware of the council's intent to open up the code with respect to changes. We are then hoping to have the formal introduction, first reading, and referral of that proposal at the council's meeting on June 28th, as you can see. Because of the way the council has divided up subject matters to its standing committee, we think this is going to be referred to what we call the BIZ committee. It stands for the Business Inspections Housing and Zoning Committee. The BIZ committee is the first committee that meets in each cycle. Each two-week cycle meets on Tuesdays at 1:30 in the afternoon. So it would then be referred to them after June 28th. And you can see I've identified several BIZ committee meetings, 3, I believe, on here, July 11th, July 25th, and August 8th. Within those 3 meetings, the BIZ committee would need to complete its work. And what committees, of course, do, I'm sure all of you are aware of this, is that's the workhorse of the council. So at committee, which is a subset, usually 6 members of council, any amendments would be considered, any proposals to refine or perfect this proposal as it's come out. The committees also conduct a public hearing, so we would give notice and conduct a public hearing so that the community could give their input as well on that proposal. And then a formal recommendation is developed by the committee and submitted to the full council. There are 2 days on here you can see for the full council. The first would be August 3rd. That would be the first opportunity, if the committee acts quickly, for the city council as a whole body to consider the recommendations of the committee. They could also bring forward further amendments to refine and perfect the proposal and adopt it. Or at the latest, their last regular meeting on the calendar this year before the August 25th statutory deadline is August 17th. And so they could also act by August 17th. Once the council acts on the official actions that would be presented to them, those would be transmitted to the mayor as part of the charter requires that all official acts go to the mayor for the mayor's consideration. And the mayor could either approve the acts and they would be effective and go to the voters. The mayor could veto them and then they'd have to return to the council for reconsideration. Or the mayor can allow them to become effective by not signing the act and then they would move forward as if approved. I would only back up here to explain that the way this process works when we submit a ballot question, The policy seeking to amend the code would be an ordinance. That's how we handle the code. That's our local laws, our local legislation, our ordinances. But the statutes require that the actual ballot language be adopted by resolution. So we're really looking at two official acts that go together as companions. One ordinance, which is the policy, and then one resolution that's the ballot language. An ordinance and a resolution under the charter both require a minimum affirmative vote of 7. So 7 affirmative votes for passage. More than that is, of course, okay, but at least 7 affirmative votes are required to pass both the ordinance and the resolution. I point that out because the direction to the attorney passed 7-5-1, and so the political calculus is quite close, obviously. Assuming that there is at least 7 affirmative votes for the ordinance and the resolutions, those then go to the mayor, and as I said, the mayor under the charter has those 3 options: approve, veto, or allow it to become effective without action. All of that has to happen before August 25th. So we are, as you can see, every cycle from now until August 25th, focused on this issue with council, and would look to, as I said, start that on June 15th with notice. Notice is a procedural step. There's not a formal vote at that step, but the first formal vote would come at the council's meeting on June 28th when we do first reading. Amendments could come as soon as first reading as part of the referral to the committee. So I think more to come, obviously, as we work on this very, very high-profile, very complex issue, and hopefully you and the community will follow along with us on that. Happy to respond to any other questions about this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Carl. Are there any questions for Mr. Carl? Commissioner Rubenstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Carl, putting aside how high profile this matter is, if the city council is not able to finalize a ballot question by the deadline, would it then be moved to 2024 when we have the federal election, or would it, or could it be?
To the chair, yes, of course, Commissioner. The matter doesn't have to go forward this year. If we don't meet the statutory deadline, they could simply push that into next year's timeline as well.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. Thank you again, Mr. Carl.
Sure.
Again, I would entertain a motion to receive and file.
So moved.
You have a second? If the clerk would call the roll, please.
Commissioner Boone,
Aye.
Clegg,
Aye.
Doherty,
Aye.
Garcia,
Aye.
Hill,
Aye.
Kozak,
Aye.
Menke,
Aye.
Harry,
Aye.
Sandberg,
Aye.
Smith,
Aye.
Vice Chair Rubenstein,
Aye.
and Chair Ginder.
Aye.
We have 12 ayes.
That passes. The final item on the agenda is public comment. Do we have any public comment that has been received electronically, Mr. Clerk? And do we have anybody that has signed up to speak?
Chair Ginder, at this time, we have not received any electronic public comments.
And is there anyone here to speak at this meeting? Seeing no one, I'll close that section of the agenda. And the last item on the agenda is adjournment. And with that, we've concluded all of our business before the Charter Commission. And without objection, we stand adjourned. Thank you.
Step by step through a renewal form. Here is a license annual invoice. It will be mailed to the address you provided in your original application. There are details on the bill that will need to be verified, like plate information, insurance provider, and other vehicle information. This is where you'll find the amount you need to pay and the due date.